The sound of wagon wheels creaked against the frozen dirt road, echoing across the narrow valley like a warning. Elizabeth Ward had traveled for weeks carrying little more than a trunk of sewing needles, a worn Bible, and the memory of a husband buried too young. When she stepped into the town of Ash Hollow, no one stopped to greet her. Faces looked up briefly, some curious, some suspicious, but then turned away as if she were smoke drifting through. She rented a narrow cottage near the chapel where the morning bells cracked the silence, and the evenings ended with her candle flickering against the frost-stained window. For 3 months she lived quietly, her hands busy with mending tears and dresses, patching boots, or stitching quilts for those who would not even look her in the eye when they left payment on the table. A widow, childless stranger, she was nothing the town wanted to claim. It might have stayed that way had she not crossed the square one late autumn afternoon, her basket of thread bouncing against her hip, and seen the commotion gather near the merchant's cart. A girl, barefoot, hair tangled with wind, was being dragged by her braid across the dirt, her thin arms straining against the sheriff's grip. The bruised apple she had snatched still rolled in the dust, forgotten. The crowd whispered and shifted, uneasy, but unwilling to interfere. Thief, the sheriff barked, his voice sharp as the lash coiled at his belt. Savage. The word hung in the air, heavier than the gray clouds threatening rain. The girl could not have been more than 16, her face streaked with dust and tears. Elizabeth saw the way her ribs showed beneath her torn dress, the way her fingers clutched the bitten fruit, as if it were the last thing keeping her alive. She might have walked on. That was what the town expected of her, silent, small, unimportant. But something inside her chest, a place long hollowed by grief, clenched with a force she could not ignore. Her late husband's voice came to her, faint and fading, but certain: do not let them break what is already fragile. Before she knew it, Elizabeth's feet had carried her into the square, her body sliding between the sheriff and the post where the whip waited. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She stood straight, though her knees trembled. She is just a child, she said, her voice low but steady. If punishment must fall, let it fall on me. The sheriff sneered, his lip curling as he spat into the dust. And why should you care? She is Indian. They take what they please. Mercy only feeds their hunger. His hand reached for the whip. Elizabeth unfastened the bodice of her plain gray dress, turning her back to the square. Because I am a woman grown, she whispered more to herself than to him. And she is only a girl. Give it to me. The whip cracked like thunder. Pain ripped through her spine and burst across her ribs. She bit down hard, her teeth grinding, refusing to cry out. Once, twice, 5 times 10. The sound carried down the alleys and across the rooftops, each lash a hymn of cruelty the town had heard before, but never resisted. Children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. The smith's wife wept openly. Still Elizabeth stood her back, torn blood staining the hem of her dress. Only when the sheriff lowered the whip did her knees falter, and even then she caught herself before she fell. The girl was released, stumbling into Elizabeth's arms, sobbing into the folds of her skirt. The sheriff muttered something about lesson taught and walked away, the crowd scattering like leaves in a sudden gust. No one offered help. No one dared. Elizabeth bent down, her breath ragged, and whispered into the girl's tangled hair, "You are safe now." Together they limped back to the cottage, their shadows stretching long against the setting sun. That night Elizabeth lay curled on her side, every welt on her back burning like fire pressed to the skin. The girl who had not yet spoken her name slept curled at her feet on a woven rug, one small hand clutching Elizabeth's fingers, even in her dreams. The fire dimmed to embers. Tears threatened, but Elizabeth held them back. She had chosen pain over silence, dignity over fear. She did not know if she would survive the winter, but she knew the girl would wake to another morning. That was enough. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves. Just before dawn, the town stirred to the sound of horses moving quiet as owls. 5 riders entered Ash Hollow, their mounts painted with stripes and handprints of mourning. Lakota men, tall and silent, their faces marked with grief and rage, dismounted in front of the chapel. No one stopped them. No one dared. They moved through the streets like shadows past the tavern, past the bakery, until they reached the seamstress's house. Inside, Elizabeth stirred in restless sleep, the girl curled against her side. The door creaked open. She blinked awake through a haze of pain and saw 5 figures kneeling in the glow of the hearth. One by one, they removed their gloves, set down their weapons, and bowed their heads to the floor. The eldest spoke, his voice deep as a riverbed. She is Wanatu, our sister, and you bled for her. Elizabeth tried to rise but winced and fell back. I did not know, she whispered, shame burning her cheeks. Another voice answered, soft but firm. You bled when no one else would. That makes you our kin now. The eldest approached, holding a bowl of crushed roots and herbs. May I? He asked, his eyes searching hers, not for weakness, but for permission. She nodded faintly, and he dipped his fingers into the paste, applying it gently to her wounds. The sting gave way to a soothing coolness, and for the first time since the lash fell, her breath came easier. Tears welled not from the pain, but from the reverence in his touch. She had not been touched with such care since her husband's hands had folded hers on their wedding night. You owe me nothing, she whispered. The sheriff, he was the one. We do not kneel for vengeance. The third brother interrupted, his face marked with a line of white ash. We kneel for truth, for honor, for the woman who stood when no one else would. Around her the others bowed, lower foreheads pressed to the floorboards. Elizabeth trembled. She had never imagined that choosing pain would lead her here at the center of something larger than herself, something sacred. By sunrise, the town knew. 5 warriors stood guard outside the widow's cottage, silent and unsmiling, their presence more powerful than any sheriff's badge. Women peered from shutters. Men muttered over mugs of whiskey. Children whispered that the quiet seamstress had been chosen. Elizabeth tried to protest, to tell them she was not worth all this. But when she tried to stand, Wanatu wrapped her thin arms around her waist and whispered, Please let us honor you. And so Elizabeth sat, her back aching, her heart unsettled as the smell of burning sage filled her home. For the first time since her husband died, she was no longer invisible. She had been seen. The day stretched long, and every hour felt like it belonged to someone else's story. Elizabeth sat by the window, her needle trembling between her fingers as she tried to thread it. Each movement sent sharp jolts of pain across her back, but the ache was not what unsettled her most. It was the silence outside, a silence thick with the steady presence of men who did not leave, who did not speak, who simply stood as if the ground itself had appointed them guardians. The townsfolk passed by in hushed steps, their eyes darting quickly from the line of warriors to the cottage door, then away again. Elizabeth saw shame in some of their faces, resentment in others, but most of all, she saw fear, not of the Lakota, but of what it meant that 5 proud men had bowed to her, when no one else in the town had dared offer help. When the sun reached its highest, Elizabeth finally set down her needle and tried to stand. Her legs shook, but she was determined to speak to them, to tell them they need not guard her. The moment she reached the threshold, Wanatu darted forward, her small hand clutching Elizabeth's arm. Don't, the girl whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with urgency. Please, let them honor you. Elizabeth looked down into the girl's wide, earnest eyes, and something within her softened. This child, who only yesterday had been dragged across the square like a criminal, now stood fiercely to protect the dignity of the men outside. Elizabeth's protest faded on her tongue. She sank back into her chair, her breath ragged, the girl curling against her side, with the fierce loyalty of someone who had never been chosen until now. As twilight fell, the eldest brother entered the cottage again, this time without asking. He carried a bundle of sage tied with leather, its scent filling the small space like smoke from an altar. He laid it on the hearth and knelt once more, his head bowed. I am Tahu, he said. His voice was low, gravelly, yet each syllable carried weight. Elizabeth studied him, his braid wrapped in copper rings, his face stern but not unkind. And I am very tired, she whispered, unable to stop the tremor in her voice. He smiled faintly, though sorrow lingered in his eyes. Then rest. You have already done more than most would dream. He stepped back, taking up a quiet vigil at the door, while the others settled outside. For the first time in months, Elizabeth allowed herself to close her eyes without fear of waking to an empty world. But sleep did not come easily. She lay listening to the rhythm of boots shifting on the porch, the scrape of a knife sharpening against stone, the faint murmur of a foreign language carried like prayer in the wind. Her body throbbed with each breath, her back a map of fire and torn skin. Yet beneath the pain pulsed something else, something steadier, something like belonging. When dawn arrived, Elizabeth opened her eyes to find Wanatu already awake, kneeling near the hearth with both of her small hands clasped around Tahu's. The sight tightened Elizabeth's chest. The child looked no longer like a thief, but like a sister, tethered now to two worlds by blood and by sacrifice. That morning whispers thickened in town like smoke. The preacher faltered, mid-sermon, his voice breaking, as he caught sight of the warrior's shadows stretching across the chapel walls. Men in the tavern spat their unease into cups of cheap whiskey. One muttered, "Who does she think she is?" Another hissed witchcraft. Yet not a single one of them spoke loudly enough for the words to carry past the door. Even the sheriff, swaggering down the street with his usual bravado, hesitated when his gaze met the calm stare of the eldest brother, sharpening his knife on the stoop. The blade caught the morning light, silent, steady, unhurried. The sheriff looked away first. Elizabeth tried again to return to her work, but every stitch brought new fire across her back. When the needle slipped from her trembling fingers, Tahu stepped forward without a word. He picked up the thread, his hands surprisingly gentle as he threaded it with practiced ease. He set it back in her palm, and only then allowed himself to meet her gaze. "You carry heat," he said quietly. Elizabeth frowned, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Heat." He nodded. "Not anger, not pride. Something holier. It burns clean." She swallowed hard, her lips parting, as if to reply, but no words came. No one, not her late husband, not even her mother, had ever spoken to her in such a way. She felt her throat tighten, her chest swell with something fragile and new. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of reverence she had never believed could be directed toward her. That evening, when Elizabeth returned from fetching water at the well, she found her porch swept clean. A small wooden stool sat neatly by the door, and on top of it lay a bundle of sage tied with twine and a folded piece of rabbit jerky wrapped in cloth. She looked around, but none of the brothers lingered close enough to be caught in the act. Only Juanita's eyes, bright with mischief and pride, whispered, "A gift, from all five." Elizabeth touched the bundle as if it might vanish at her fingertips. Why, she breathed. The girl tilted her head, her answer simple and unshakable. "Because you didn't run." Elizabeth carried the gifts inside her heart, unsteady. She had spent so long being overlooked that even the smallest offering felt like a miracle. She placed the stool near the fire, the bundle of sage above the hearth, and sat in silence until the flames steadied. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt as though the world had given something back. That night, Tahu sat beside her by the dimming fire. His brothers kept watch, outside their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. He did not speak at first, and neither did she. The quiet grew heavy, not with discomfort, but with meaning. At last he said, "We heard what they plan." Elizabeth's breath caught. "What do you mean?" But even before he answered, she knew. The town would not endure this challenge to its order. Men with liquor and rope and hate disguised as justice would come. Tahu's voice was grave, his eyes steady as stone. "They meet tonight. They will come for you." Elizabeth tried to protest. "I represent nothing," she said too quickly. His reply was firm, a voice that carried like iron. "No. You represent the one thing they fear: a woman. They cannot bend a fire, they cannot put out. That is why they will come." Her throat went dry. She searched his eyes, desperate and afraid, and whispered, "And what will you do?" He leaned closer, his words quiet but unshakable. "We will burn brighter." And in that moment, with the fire's glow painting his face in gold and shadow, Elizabeth believed him. Not because he promised her safety, but because for the first time in her life, someone saw her not as fragile, not as broken, but as flame. The night gathered heavy over Ash Hollow, thick with the smell of damp earth and smoke from the tavern. Elizabeth sat upright by the window, her husband's rifle resting across her lap. She had pulled it from beneath the floorboards earlier, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of memory. It had belonged to a man who had died too soon, a life she could not protect. Now it sat across her knees like an oath renewed. She prayed she would never need to fire it, but she could no longer pretend the world would leave her untouched. Outside, she could hear the steady pacing of boots, the brothers keeping rhythm like wolves circling a den. Juanita slept on the rug, her breath soft, her small hands curled around the edge of Elizabeth's skirt, even in dreams. Elizabeth could not close her eyes. Her back still burned from the lashes, but the pain was a reminder, not a weakness. She had not been broken. She had chosen to stand, and she would again. It was close to midnight when the first flicker of light appeared on the ridge beyond the chapel. At first she thought it was only lantern glow from a late traveler, but then she saw more three torches weaving through the dark like fire snakes swaying in the hands of men who had drunk courage from a bottle and anger from each other. One or two stirred, whispering, "It's them." Elizabeth's heart clenched. She rose before she could think, the rifle slung low in her arms, her body aching, but her spine unbent. When she opened the door, the cold night air rushed over her, sharp with pine and frost. Tahu turned from his post, his eyes meeting hers. He said nothing, but he shifted aside, leaving space for her among them. She stepped forward, not behind. The men came stumbling into the square, their voices loud, their words slurred. "You're harboring thieves and savages," one shouted, his torch sputtering. "We're here to end it." Elizabeth's breath fogged in the cold. She lifted the rifle, not aiming, only holding it steady. Her voice rang out clearer than she expected. "You want to end something?" she asked. "Then end your fear, end your hatred, end the lie that mercy is weakness." Her words hung in the stillness like a bell toll. The men faltered, their steps slowing. One raised his hand, perhaps to draw a weapon or to strike, but he never had the chance. Tahu moved quick and quiet, his hand closing around the man's wrist with a grip that froze him in place. His voice was soft, almost kind. "You don't belong here anymore." And she does. The silence that followed was deeper than any shout. The other men looked at the line of warriors, at Elizabeth standing unflinching, with blood still crusted into the back of her dress, and their courage faltered. They stumbled back, their torches wavering. It wasn't the rifle that made them retreat. It was the sight of 5 warriors standing as pillars, and a woman between them who had already bled for justice. One by one, they turned, muttering curses to hide their fear, and vanished into the night. Elizabeth lowered the rifle slowly, her arms trembling, only after it was over. She had not fired a shot, yet the world had shifted. The brothers did not cheer, did not speak. They simply stood beside her, the firelight catching the determination in their eyes. The night held its breath, and for the first time Elizabeth felt the air around her grow lighter, as though even the darkness had chosen to kneel. By morning the town buzzed with rumor. Neighbors whispered behind shutters, men huddled at the tavern. Children snuck glances at the cottage where the seamstress lived under sacred guard. Elizabeth swept her porch with slow, steady motions, the rifle leaning silently against the wall. She wore her apron freshly washed, though the stains of blood could never fully fade. At her side, Wanadu carried a bundle of herbs, her head high, her small frame radiating pride. The brothers sharpened wooden poles in the yard, their movements patient and precise, as if preparing for a kind of peace the town had long forgotten, peace with teeth. The sheriff passed by once, his swagger brittle, his eyes darting nervously to the eldest brother, sitting calm on the stoop knife, glinting as it sliced slowly across a strip of wood. The sheriff did not linger. Inside, Elizabeth lit the fire and brewed bitterroot tea with hands that no longer shook. Each sip burned her tongue, but she welcomed it, a reminder she was still alive, still choosing. When Tahu entered carrying another bundle of sage, she met his gaze without flinching. "You don't have to do this," she told him softly. He shook his head. "We kneel not for what we must, but for what is true." His words wrapped around her like a cloak. She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. That night, as she lay in bed with Wanatu curled against her side, she whispered into the girl's hair, "Let this be the end of running." Outside, the brothers paced in the cold, their shadows tall against the chapel wall. The wind carried Elizabeth's words into the trees, and though no one else could hear them, the night itself seemed to answer back, "You already have." The second day after the torches, Ash Hollow woke to a hush that was not fear, but reckoning. Elizabeth stepped outside before the sun had cleared the ridge, the ground crisp with frost and the air smelling of pine and wood smoke. Juanita slipped her small hand into Elizabeth's without a word, as if the night had woven an invisible thread between them. On the road beyond the chapel, a slow column began to appear, not loud and not hurried, figures on foot and on horseback, wrapped in winter hides, braids dark against pale morning. They came without drums or war cries, only the soft thud of hooves and the quiet creak of leather. 15 men, then 3 women, then 2 boys riding double, then an old man leading a pony laden with bundles. Townsfolk peered from behind curtains, mouths tight, eyes narrowed, but the line did not pause for their stares. It came straight to the seamstress's yard and stopped, and for a breath all was still. Tahu stood at the fence, one palm lifted in greeting, as if they were meeting in a home, rather than in a town that had tried to break a child. Elizabeth felt her heart climb to her throat. She had known the five brothers would not abandon her, but she had not imagined they would open a door wide enough for a people to walk through. Wanatu squeezed her hand once and then let go, stepping forward with her chin lifted. She said a string of words Elizabeth could not understand, her voice quick and sure, a bird's song shaped into language. An older woman answered, her hair streaked with gray, her face strong as a mountain. One by one, the newcomers laid something by the porch, a pouch of tobacco beads strung with bone and turquoise, a small carving of a hawk in soapstone, a length of braided sweetgrass, a packet of cornmeal wrapped in soft leather. None of them spoke to Elizabeth at first. If there was a ceremony here, it was not for show. It was for gravity. Elizabeth did not know what to do with her hands. She wanted to kneel, to bow, to say she was not worthy, that she had only done what a person ought to do when a child was about to be hurt. But Wanedu turned, her eyes bright with a joy that looked like relief made visible. "It is all right," the girl whispered. "Stand. Just stand and let them see you." So Elizabeth stood, her braidless hair tucked behind her ears, her back a map of throbbing pain beneath her plain dress. She felt unmade and remade all at once, like a vessel cracked in firing and fired again into something stronger. Tahu stepped to her side, not in front, never in front, and folded his arms as if to say, "She does not stand alone." The old man with the pony approached last. He set down a bundle, untied it gently, and placed a flat stone wrapped in cloth into Elizabeth's hands. It was warm, almost living. "For memory of heat," he said in slow, careful English. "Keep by your heart." Elizabeth cradled the stone. It hummed faintly against her ribs, as if remembering some earlier fire. She thought of the nights after her husband and child died, when heat had felt like theft, because there had been none for them. How she had let the stove go cold, rather than admit she needed it. Now a stranger gave her warmth without asking what she would pay. She swallowed hard. "Thank you," she breathed. The woman with gray in her braids touched Wanatu's cheek and then glanced at Elizabeth. Her eyes were not soft exactly, but they held a depth that made Elizabeth want to weep. Language crossed on gestures, a nod, a lifted palm, a brief glance at Tahu, a tiny bow from Elizabeth in return. It was enough. By midday, the porch was crowded with offerings. The yard smelled of sage and cedar and something sweet she could not name. The brothers worked quietly, whittling stakes, mending a broken strap, boiling water in a blackened kettle at the fire ring near the fence. The townsfolk drifted closer in twos and threes, not brave enough to enter, not bold enough to pretend they saw nothing. The preacher passed once, his hat in his hands, and when he made to speak, the eldest brother only looked at him until he faltered, replaced the hat, and moved on. Elizabeth felt oddly calm. She swept the step, shook out the quilt, and set her old kettle to boil on the hearth. When the water sang, she brewed bitterroot and added a pinch of the new herbs they had brought, the steam curling like the slow untwisting of a fist inside her chest. Wanedu stood beside her by the table, sorting the gifts with care any mother would envy. "This is for protection," she said, touching the sweetgrass. "This is for truth," she said, laying a feather painted with ochre in a place of honor. "This is for winter," she said, setting aside a pouch of tallow and dried berries. She hesitated and then picked up a small carved token, shaped like a mountain with 3 waves etched at the base. "This," she whispered, "is for those who shelter storms." She placed it in Elizabeth's palm and closed her fingers around it. The token was warm, not from heat, but from passing through hands that meant what they did. Elizabeth's throat stung. "I don't know if I've sheltered anything," she said. "You sheltered me," Wanatu answered simply. "And a child is a storm when hurt." In the afternoon, Tao came in from the yard with a bundle of thin sticks and a small wooden comb. He set them on the table without ceremony, then waited. Elizabeth had learned enough of their quiet to know the waiting meant this was hers to accept or refuse. Wanedu reached for the comb and held it up like an invitation. "May?" she asked, suddenly shy, as if she feared a no. Might break something fragile they had made together. Elizabeth's hand went to her hair by instinct. It had been her shield these last years, unadorned and unclaimed, a kind of invisibility. Now the girl's eyes held a plea that felt less like vanity than like ritual. Elizabeth nodded. Yes, she said. Show me. They sat by the open door where the light fell gentlest. Juanedo dipped her fingers in a small pot of bear grease and began to part the hair with the rounded end of the comb, slow and careful. Tight near the scalp, loose near the ends, she worked in silence that did not require filling. Elizabeth felt the pull and the release the order made from ordinary strands. The ache in her back kept time, but the sting had dulled to a tide. She could rise with, rather than drown beneath. Tahu watched from the threshold, his arms crossed lightly, his gaze neither hungry nor possessive, only present. When the first braid fell across Elizabeth's shoulder, she reached up to touch it and found her hand trembling. 3 strands, Juanedo murmured. Body, mind, spirit. Together they do not tear. The old instinct to apologize rose in Elizabeth. I am not worthy, I am not strong. I am too late to become anything new, and then faded, burned to ash in a heat that finally felt like her own. She remembered the words Tahu had given her that morning. You carry heat that burns clean. The braid seemed to catch it, to hold it so gently that it no longer scorched. When Juanedo finished the second braid and tied each with a strip of leather, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Elizabeth's for the briefest of heartbeats. It was not a kiss. It was an oath. Elizabeth closed her eyes and let herself breathe it in. Outside, the line between town and yard had become a kind of border no one crossed without permission. A man in a stained vest approached too quickly and stopped short when Tahu shifted 1 pace forward, not threatening, merely certain. The man muttered and moved on. 2 children stood near the fence and watched, their eyes wide. The older one tugged the younger back when he reached as if to touch the carved hawk on the porch rail. The sheriff did not return that afternoon. Rumor had it his second had ridden out before dawn and had not come back. Elizabeth did not ask why. Some answers belonged to the hush of things that had been avoided too long. As evening drew down, the air turned blue and then violet, and the scent of meat smoking drifted from the fire ring. One of the visiting women kneaded fat into flour at a low table they had set up near the fence, her hands sure, her movements steady. Elizabeth watched the rhythm and felt a yearning rise that startled her. She moved to the little kitchen and found her old tin of flour. Her fingers were stiff, her back sore, but muscle remembered what grief had tried to make her forget. She kneaded with the heel of her palm turned folded pressed, letting silence mix in like water. Tahu returned with more kindling and paused in the doorway. He said nothing for a time. Then you look different. Elizabeth glanced up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. I feel different. He nodded. Because you were seen, she held his gaze. Because I was allowed to stand. The first round of bread went into the small iron pot, and the smell rose like a hymn traveling through the chapel walls into the cooling yard. Juanedo drifted nearer, eyes shining. Elizabeth broke the first piece when it was ready and put it in the girl's hands without words. Tahu waited until the second and then accepted his share with a small bow. Not to her, she realized, but to the act of making. The others ate on woven mats near the fire, passing strips of smoked venison and trading quiet remarks that were less conversation than weaving. Elizabeth listened to the cadence and felt the stone in her pocket grow warm again, as if agreeing that this was heat worth remembering. After they had eaten, the old man, who had given her the stone, took a seat near the hearth inside and began to hum. It was not a tune she knew, but it settled into her bones like something a mother might hum to a fevered child. Elizabeth rested her palms against her knees and let the sound pass through the places that still hurt. When the humming ended, Tahu reached into a small leather pouch and drew out a token shaped like a hawk with wings half spread. He turned it once in his fingers and then placed it on the mantel among the day's offerings. A promise, he said softly. Not a chain. She felt her mouth quiver and pressed her lips together until she could trust them to shape the truth. I do not want to be claimed like a prize, she said the words low. Then do not be, he answered. Belonging is not a prize. It is a choice made again each morning. The fire burned low. The visitors settled themselves beyond the fence line, not camping so much as keeping watch that did not require vigilance to be real. Elizabeth stood at the door, the braids heavy and new against her shoulders, and looked out at the yard that had become threshold. She thought of the square where she had bled and of the woman she had been when the whip sang the one who believed pain was the only language she could speak loudly. She touched the braid and felt the lie loosen its hold. "I would like to know your whole name," she said without turning. The quiet behind her shifted. Tahu's voice came like the low note of a drum. "Tahatan," he said. "Hawk cry, my father's name, and mine now." She turned then, letting the syllables settle on her tongue like something warm. "Tahatan," she repeated, and her voice did not shake. He smiled small but certain. "And yours?" She hesitated only a moment. "Elizabeth." She said not as confession, but as return. "The name I buried. I am taking it back." Juanito, drowsy on the rug, half woke, and whispered a word Elizabeth had heard earlier among the women. "Oyate," the girl murmured as if naming what had already happened. "People, but also those you would die for." Elizabeth knelt careful of her back and brushed a strand of hair from Juanito's brow. "Sleep," she whispered. "Tomorrow we bake more." Behind her, Tahatan added a log to the fire and sat not too near and not far, and the cottage filled with the kind of quiet that does not empty a room but sanctifies it. Outside, the town kept its distance. Inside, heat remembered itself, and a woman who had thought she was made of ashes learned that a fire relit by many hands can burn steadier than the kind one tends alone. Morning came soft and pale, the sky washed in a thin veil of mist. Elizabeth woke before Juanito stirred the braids over her shoulders, still holding their shape as if they too had stood guard through the night. She rose carefully, her back stiff but steadier now, and stepped outside. The yard was quiet but not empty. Two of the younger brothers sat sharpening poles, their breath visible in the chill, while another tended a pot over the fire pit, the scent of boiled corn rising into the cold air. Tahu was not in sight, though his presence lingered in every detail. The stacked kindling, the neat line of boots drying on the rail, the way the fire burned evenly, without falter. Elizabeth tightened her shawl and moved to fetch water from the well, her feet crunching over frost. For once she felt no need to rush, no need to fear the square she would pass. She walked slowly, and with each step the silence of the town followed her like a shadow that had learned respect. Neighbors watched from windows. Some looked away quickly, others nodded faintly, but none spat or sneered. The post where she had taken the lashes still stood in the center, scrubbed clean now, but Elizabeth saw it as if blood still darkened the dirt beneath. She set her bucket down by the well, drew the rope hand over hand, and thought of how pain leaves marks no scrubbing can erase. She filled the bucket, turned to carry it back, and found a woman waiting, one she had once sewn a hem for without charge, a widow as gray-haired as the frost. The woman said nothing, only pressed a folded blanket into Elizabeth's arms. For the girl, she murmured, then walked away before Elizabeth could answer. The weight of it startled her more than the lashes had kindness unasked for. She clutched it to her chest and carried both blanket and water back to the cottage, her eyes stinging. Juanito was awake when she returned, combing her hair with the carved wooden comb. She beamed when she saw the blanket. They began to see, the girl said, her voice bright with a triumph, too old for her years. Elizabeth spread the blanket on the bed, smoothing its rough weave with reverent hands. Or maybe they begin to feel shame, she answered softly. Juanito shook her head. Shame is the start of seeing. Elizabeth had no reply to that, only a swell of wonder that this child once dragged by her hair through the dirt could speak wisdom as if she had been waiting her whole life to be heard. Tahu returned by mid-morning, carrying a bundle of wood and a small pouch tied with rawhide. He laid them on the table without ceremony. "They will come," he said. Elizabeth frowned. Who, he did not answer immediately, only stoked the hearth until the flames leapt. Then he met her eyes. "My brothers, the 5 who knelt. They come not for apology, but for something more sacred." Elizabeth's hands tightened on the braid at her shoulder. "Do I need to do anything?" Her voice quavered, though she tried to steady it. Tahu's face softened, though his words remained firm. "Just stand. Just let them see you." The rest of the day stretched like a held breath. Elizabeth tried to sew, to sweep, to knead dough, but her hands refused the rhythm. She caught herself glancing at the door again and again, as if the weight of what was coming pressed against the very air. Juanito sensed it too, her energy restless, darting from fire to window, from hearth to porch. "They are close," she whispered, as the sun climbed higher. Elizabeth placed her palms flat on the table to still them. She told herself she was no different than yesterday, only a woman who had refused to step aside. But she knew that was no longer true. When five men kneel, the world changes, even if you do nothing but stand. The first sound was not hooves, but silence. The chatter of sparrows ceased, the hammering at the smithy paused. Even the preacher's voice fell away mid-prayer. Then they appeared, five figures riding into town, with no haste and no hesitation, their horses steady, their faces painted with quiet solemnity. They dismounted at the fence, removed their gloves, and walked toward the cottage in a line. Elizabeth stood alone by the fire, her dress plain but clean, her braids dark ropes shining in the sunlight. Her heart hammered, but her spine held straight. Tahu stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his gaze steady, but not intervening. This moment was hers. One by one, the brothers stepped forward. Each knelt not in shame, but in reverence, and laid something at her feet. The first placed a carved hawk wing spread. The second offered a piece of turquoise blue as a summer sky. The third laid a pouch of tobacco. The fourth, a braid of sweet grass tied with sinew. The fifth, a single feather painted in ochre. No words, no demands, only gifts, each an echo of their blood and spirit. Elizabeth's eyes welled, but she did not cry. She bowed her head, her voice low. "Thank you for seeing me." The eldest brother rose, his face grave, but his eyes alight with something that looked like awe. "You reminded us what it means to protect our own." Then, as quietly as they had come, they turned and left, their steps heavy with meaning, but light with peace. Elizabeth bent slowly, her back protesting, and gathered the gifts in trembling hands. She carried them inside and placed them on the mantel above the hearth. The carved hawk caught the glow of the fire. The turquoise gleamed like water, the feather curled gently in the heat. Tahu stood in the doorway, his arms folded, watching. His voice was low, rough with something she could not yet name. "You know what this means, don't you?" She met his gaze, her chin high. Despite the tears, she fought back. "That I've been claimed," his brow furrowed. "By who?" She drew a breath, her voice softer than smoke. "By myself first, and maybe by this place." Tahu stepped closer, his shadow crossing hers, his words almost a murmur. "And by someone who waits with the fire lit." The world seemed to still. Rain began to fall softly, not enough to soak the earth, only enough to scent the air with memory. Elizabeth stood in the open doorway, the droplets glistening on her hair, her braids heavy with damp. Behind her, the hearth glowed warm. Before her, the brothers' gifts lined the mantel like a promise. Tahu rebuilt the fire. His hands steady, his silence sure. Juanetu slept, already curled beneath the new blanket, safe as a child who believes at last she belongs. Elizabeth stepped barefoot onto the porch, the rain cold against her skin, and whispered into the night, "I thought I was giving up when I took the lashes, but maybe I was stepping into something braver." She did not expect an answer, but Tahu's voice carried from the hearth, quiet and certain. "You didn't just step in, you knelt, and the whole tribe followed you." Morning broke with a clean light that made every shape feel sharper, as if the world had been washed in a basin and set out to dry. Elizabeth rose with the first warmth from the hearth and kneaded dough at the small table, the rhythm finding her hands before her thoughts could crowd it out. Juanetu hummed something soft while sorting herbs into neat bundles, pausing now and then to sniff a leaf and smile to herself. Outside, the brothers moved with that same unhurried purpose she had begun to recognize as a kind of discipline. Not duty for its own sake, but alignment, as if each act lived exactly where it belonged and therefore made no noise. Tahatan came in with kindling stacked in his arms. He set it down by the hearth and stood for a moment, not speaking the way he sometimes did when words would only lessen the truth of a thing. Elizabeth tore a piece from the first loaf and passed it to him. Not as a host and not as a guest, but as a person who had made something and wished it to be shared. He accepted with a small nod that felt like a vow more than a courtesy. When he ate, he closed his eyes, and she saw the muscles in his jaw loosen the way a man lets go of guarding for a heartbeat. She thought of how hunger is not only a stomach's problem. When he opened his eyes again, the room seemed warmer. They spent the morning in small tasks that added up to a life. Juanita carried water in careful trips and rinsed the stone bowls with cloths that Elizabeth had stitched from shirt sleeves no one else wanted. The youngest of the brothers mended a strap and tested it twice before he would call it done. The woman with gray streaks in her braids returned with a sack of flour and a wrapped bundle of dried meat and left it with a nod that understood gratitude did not need translation. Elizabeth smoothed the sack with both palms and whispered, "Thank you anyway," because words carried their own heat and she had starved herself of them for too long. By midday, she needed air beyond the yard. She told Wanatu she would walk to the river just to see the water and remind her legs what it was to move without fear. Tahatan looked up from splitting wood and took one step as if to follow. She met his gaze and shook her head, not to refuse him, only to say, "I need to cross a short distance on my own." He inclined his head once and returned to his work. When she passed the square, the post stood there like a thorn buried under skin. No one gathered around it now. A pair of boys kicked a stone near the general store, looked at her, and did not smirk. Across the street, the smith's wife lifted a hand in a gesture too small to be called a wave, and yet large enough to move something inside Elizabeth that had been heavy and quiet for years. The river was low, winter slow, the water amber, where it shallowed around stones. Elizabeth crouched on the bank with care, mindful of her back, and trailed her fingertips in the cold. The chill climbed her arm and steadied her head. She let the current carry a little of the ache away and breathed until the lingering tremor in her chest found a rhythm that could hold. When she rose, she found someone had come near without breaking the silence. Tahatan stood a few paces back with a strip of leather in one hand and something carved in the other. He did not apologize for following her any more than she would have apologized for wanting him near. He held out the carved piece. It was a small bird wings, slightly raised, not a hawk, small or nimble. She turned it over in her palm. It fit there, as if it had been waiting for that place. He spoke first, his voice a little rough, as if unused for too many winters. "My mother carved birds when a child had fever," he said. "She said a bird remembers how to lift a body even when the body forgets." Elizabeth felt tears pressure the back of her eyes, not hot, just heavy. She closed her fingers around the small bird and did not let it go. "I did forget," she said. "I forgot everything that was not survival." He looked down at the strip of leather in his other hand, and then at her braids. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he tied the bird with the leather and looped it gently around the end of one braid, his fingertips careful not to graze her skin more than he must. He stepped back then to give the moment room to settle. On their walk back, they did not speak much. A field hawk circled high above, turning on the air with a patience that made Elizabeth breathe slower. At the edge of town, Wanatu ran to meet them, her feet throwing up little puffs of dust. She reached for the carved bird the way a child reaches for a story they already love. Tahatan told her its meaning, not treating her like a child, and Wanatu looked at Elizabeth with a solemn pride that should have been too big for her small face and yet fit without spilling. The cottage smelled of sage when they entered, and someone had set a pot of soup on the hearth with a sprig of something green laid across the lid like a blessing. The afternoon turned to work of a different kind. The old man who had given Elizabeth the warm stone came in at the invitation of a look and sat near the hearth. He asked for no chair, only warmth. He traced shapes in the ash with a burnt stick and spoke in low phrases. Monetu translated now and then, though Elizabeth found she understood more than the words. He spoke of winter as a teacher of how fires burn brightest, not when fed wildly, but when fed steadily. He told a story about a woman who braided her grief into 3 strands and wore it until it softened from rope to ribbon and finally to thread, and then she sewed it into a quilt so it could keep others warm. Elizabeth listened until her breath lengthened and her shoulders dropped. When he finished, the old man looked at her with eyes like creek stone worn smooth by time. He tapped the mantle with the end of his stick where the gifts lined in simple grandeur. He made a small sign with his fingers, a circle and then a line drawn through it. Wanadu said softly, "He says a circle that refuses to open is a chain. A circle that opens and closes is a home." Elizabeth felt the sentence anchor itself in her chest, the way a thrown hook bites and holds fast. She glanced at Tahatan and found him already watching, and for a moment she could not breathe, for the kindness of being witnessed without being asked to perform. As the sun fell, a fine snow began, the kind that dusts rather than burdens. Wanadu leaned against Elizabeth's side with her sewing on her lap, a rabbit doll taking shape under small, fierce hands. Tahatan tended the fire with that same craft she was beginning to recognize in everything he did. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. The brothers drifted in and out, not to guard each threshold like soldiers, but to keep company with the evening, as if it were an old friend who had earned such care. Elizabeth laid out the bread from the second loaf and sliced the dried meat. When they ate, Tahatan passed her a piece with his fingers, and she pressed hers briefly to his, as she took it, not by accident. After they had eaten and the room had settled into the soft sounds of night, Elizabeth spoke a name she had not dared share with anyone in Ash Hollow. Not Elizabeth, the name she had called back to herself from the ground where she had buried it, but the small name her mother had used when the world was kind. She spoke it like a secret she was brave enough to live with again. Tahatan repeated it low, shaping the syllables with care. "I will hold it the way I hold coals," he said. "Close enough to keep it alive, not so close I burn it." She laughed, then a sudden light sound that startled her and made Wanatu look up with a grin. It felt like the first time a door opens that everyone had forgotten was there. Later, when the brothers stepped outside to give the night its space, Tahatan remained near the door on his woven mat. Wanatu curled on her blanket and fell asleep with her hand still holding the rabbit doll's ear. Elizabeth lay facing the ceiling and watched the fire throw its slow gold against the rafters. She spoke into the quiet without turning her head. "When you said I carry heat that burns clean, I did not know what to do with those words." Tahatan answered after a pause that felt like he was measuring truth, not time. "That heat is not a weapon," he said. "It is a hearth. It says this is where warmth lives, and this is how far the wild things may come." She thought of the men with torches, of how they had turned away before a shot was fired. "I never wanted to be feared," she said. He shifted the mat, rustling softly. "You were not feared," he said. "They feared what they could no longer pretend about themselves when they looked at you." Snow ticked against the window. The fire settled into its low, firm glow. Elizabeth turned onto her side, careful of her back, and let her hand slide under the blanket until her fingers found the warm stone the old man had given her. It held its quiet heat the way memory does when invited but not forced. She closed her eyes. The day had held no spectacle yet. Her body knew it had been changed in a way no crowd could measure. She had walked to the river without permission. She had fed and been fed. She had heard a small name said back to her in a voice that made it sound like it belonged to this place as much as it had belonged to her mother's kitchen. She wanted to say, "I am home," and did not, because she had learned that some truths grow stronger when they are warmed a while before being spoken aloud. Before sleep took her, she heard Tahatan's voice, a bare whisper, as if he were speaking to the rafters so the beams would carry it if she could not. "Tomorrow," he said, "my brothers will return with bundles wrapped in color. They will not ask you for anything. They will tell you what they see." She did not answer, not because she did not care, but because the answer lived now as a steadiness in her chest. The snow deepened. The town beyond their walls turned in on itself, like a body remembering how to heal. Inside the chapel cottage, the heat lay down among them, like a tame animal taught by many hands to stay and not run when a door opens. And Elizabeth Braid, heavy with a small bird that remembered how to lift, slept without bracing for the old pain to wake her before dawn. The following morning broke clear. The storm spent the world covered in a white hush that seemed to honor rather than conceal. Elizabeth stirred before the fire, her back still aching, but no longer ruling her every breath. Juaneto slept curled at her side, her small hand clutching the rabbit doll she had finished the night before, stitches uneven but proud. Tahatan was already outside, his shadow visible through the thin frost of the window, chopping wood with calm, deliberate strikes. Each swing rose and fell like the measure of a hymn. Elizabeth sat up slowly, fingers brushing the braid that now carried the carved bird at its end. She whispered to herself as if to test the truth aloud. "I belong." Before noon, the 5 brothers returned. They came without fanfare, yet the town quieted, as though every voice knew the weight of their approach. Their horses left deep prints in the snow, each breath puffing white against the still air. They dismounted and walked to the cottage with the same solemnity as the first day they had knelt. But this time they carried bundles wrapped in colored cloth, red, blue, yellow, green, each bound with sinew and feathers. Elizabeth stood by the hearth, her dress plain but freshly washed, the braids over her shoulders gleaming in the firelight. She felt her hands tremble, but she did not hide them. Tahu entered first, his face unreadable, then stepped aside so his brothers could pass one by one. Each knelt, placed a bundle at her feet, and bowed until their foreheads touched the floor. She lowered herself carefully, knees pressing against the worn boards, and opened the first bundle. Inside lay beads strung with turquoise and bone gleaming with care. The second held a braid of sweetgrass, fragrant even in the cold. The third carried a bowstring coiled like a promise. The fourth, a carved soapstone figure of a hawk with wings unfurled. The last bundle she opened slowly, a folded piece of hide inked with careful script in Blackfeet letters. Tahu bent near, translating only one line aloud. "She who bore the pain for our sister is now ours too." Elizabeth's vision blurred, her breath catching on the edge of a sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth, not to silence grief, but to hold back the force of joy that broke through like water after drought. Juanetu came to her side, slipping her small hand into Elizabeth's. "See?" she whispered fiercely. "I told you. They see you." Elizabeth pulled the girl close, resting her cheek against her hair. The brothers rose silent, their eyes never leaving her, not with hunger or pity, but with reverence. Tahu stepped forward, his hands empty, his voice low but steady. "These are not gifts. They are signs. Each says the same thing: you are kin." Elizabeth's tears fell freely now, not from sorrow but from being seen in a way she had thought the world had forgotten how to do. She nodded, unable to speak, her fingers closing around Juanetu's tighter. For the first time since her husband and child were buried, she felt no weight pressing her to the earth. Instead, she felt the ground hold her up. That evening, they gathered outside, the sky violet and heavy with stars, the air crisp with the promise of deeper winter. A fire blazed in the ring beyond the chapel, as flames licking upward as if eager to reach the constellations. Elizabeth baked the last of her flour into bread, serving it on a carved wooden tray that one of the brothers had left by her door. They sat on woven mats around the fire, passing venison and laughter, as if these too were sacred offerings. Juanetu leaned against Elizabeth's side, her head warm on her shoulder. Tahu sat across the fire, the glow catching the copper rings in his braid, his eyes steady every time they met hers. He passed her a piece of bread, not as a host, not as a guest, but as a man offering half his life. Her fingers grazed his, and for a moment neither of them pulled away. Later, as the fire sank to embers and the others drifted into quiet rest, Tahattan remained. He sat near the door on his mat, his knife sheathed, his body finally at ease. Elizabeth lay on her blanket, Juanetu tucked safe at her side, and whispered into the dimness, "I thought I was giving up when I took the lashes, but maybe I was stepping into something braver." She did not expect an answer, but his voice carried through the hush. "You didn't just step in. You knelt. And the whole tribe followed you." Silence settled after, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds two hands, that breathes like prayer. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her heart full, her scars still burning, but no longer alone. For once, the night did not feel like something to endure. It felt like belonging. And when dawn came again, the town woke to a world already changed. Not by law, not by decree, but by the unshakable truth that 5 warriors and a widow had written in blood-bread, and fire mercy is not weakness. It is the fiercest kind of strength.